Yeah, I'm Magnus Imber. I'm a doctoral student at Boston College in the philosophy department. I guess this is sort of a good segue into how I will be structuring my presentation today. Since I'm not coming from the IHL world, legal world, I think the paper itself is still fairly intelligible because it carefully sort of walks through maybe maybe more philosophical or however else you want to say it, this approach. And so for that reason, I'm planning on reading sort of a excerpted version of written remarks, mostly from my paper, some other stuff. I have the slides as well as a visual so that no one falls asleep while I am doing so. But just sort of a fair warning in case any of your sensibilities are offended by a more written presentation. Well, so since Thursday, I have revised my plan to introduce this topic just a little bit to you all. After the address given by Ambassador Clement, which directly dealt with artificial weapons systems and recent discussions on possible regulations thereof, whether via IHL or otherwise. The simpler and thereby faster way to introduce my project seemed to pick up on a point he made, namely that though we're drawing ever closer to sort of an age of autonomous weapons systems as a used means of warfare, our conception of what AWS are doesn't extend far past the mere definitional notion that once deployed, such weapons are going to engage in targeting with no real intervention or selection on the part of its deployers. Hence, my presentation today is really just going to work toward bringing increased conceptual clarity to autonomous weapons systems. So though my paper only briefly mentions them, and for the sake of time, this talk is going to skip over them, important ethical and legal questions will hopefully benefit from this sort of endeavor that I have in mind. So to this end, I first consider the arguments for considering AWS as agents to try and draw insight from the literature surrounding a similar case, namely that of targeted killing. That will be in section 2. Then, in the third section, I turn to the alternative conceptual standpoint, namely that of viewing AWS as mere instruments. This I do through a similar consultation with the targeted killing literature, in addition to relevant historical descriptions of varying sorts of warfare contexts. And after I go through and critique both the prominent defenders of these standpoints, I conclude by presenting my own argument that AWS should be construed as instruments, though sort of in a qualified sense. The derivative conclusions that follow then open up the concept of autonomous weapons to various ethical issues. The goal that sort of arrive at this chasm or ravine is that which is going to separate us from the near future of killer robots, as the ambassador funnily called them on Thursday. How we cross it, though, outside of this paper scope, is a worthy subject of future work. So this is just attempting to lay some foundation or groundwork for those kind of projects. So going into section 2, from the outset, sort of want to stipulate that for the purposes of this paper, the idea that AWS are genuinely free agents is just going to be something that I sort of outright reject. I mean, a truly free machine, I think, is in a sense a contradiction in terms. And it's not something that we're going to reasonably be entertaining here. If you would like to, then my paper is probably uninteresting to you wholesale. And moreover, none of the theorists that promote so-called AWS as agent position believe AWS to be truly, genuinely free. I at least haven't seen this position sort of strongly advanced in literature. Philosophers of mind are welcome to probe the question of an artificial consciousness and the possibility thereof, a possibility that I seriously doubt. But in the relevant literature, the AWS as agent stance is always a qualified position. So though it might perhaps be better termed AWS as quasi-agent or something, I defer to the simpler phrasing used in the existing literature. Okay, now, to the matter at hand. So given that, for now, truly autonomous weapons lie beyond the horizon, so to say, the existing literature on the matter concerns broadly speculative, untested theory. And while this is all well and good, especially as concerns the moral theorizing about such weapons, there don't exist wide bodies of literature or thoroughly debated policies about AWS. To benefit the present project of conceptual clarification, proximate debates can be looked at for guidance. In this section, I first am going to compare the employment of AWS to the more established practice of targeted killing. Building on the conclusions drawn from this comparison, the fruits of the targeted killing debate can hopefully be employed to resolve present disputes concerning the use of autonomous weapons. My objective here is simply the scrutinizing of prominent objections toward AWS, especially through reflection on the unique warfare context that terrorist threats present. So the definition of targeted killing offered by Stephen David incorporates three criteria, which I find quite plausible. The target is attacked, 1, specifically, 2, intentionally, and 3, with state sanction. While the second criterion does mark out such attacks as targeted, it only does so in the broadest of senses. Strategic bombing raids are certainly intentional. The targets in question are intended as such. These sorts of wide-reaching attacks, for which the label targeted killing seems unsuitable, are eliminated from consideration by the first criterion, specificity. The targeted killing, properly construed, is an attack on a singular target, whether that be an individual or a collection thereof. Broadly, then, the third criterion enables the conception of a targeted killing to be even more fine-grained. By incorporating the role of governmental authorization in the practice of targeted killings, these sorts of attacks can be distinguished from, say, assassinations. Though AWS attacks share in common the criterion of state sanction, what distinguishes them from targeted killings is twofold. Both specificity and intentionality are not so straightforwardly present. Despite the unique issues that both characterize AWS and might serve to distinguish its attacks from targeted killings, the literature on and active debate that surrounds targeted killings serves as a useful touchstone for the present project of conceptual clarification. So, on the one hand, the same questions that have surrounded the employment of targeted killings are apropos in parallel AWS debates. Concerns over AWS are well captured by, for example, Kenneth R. Himes' questions concerning targeted killings. Reading here, who decides upon a target, by what criteria, what standard of evidence is necessary, what review procedures are in place, what procedure for holding decision makers accountable for errors is in place. These are, per the aforementioned criteria, matters of specificity and intentionality. On the other hand, the practical motivations to both answer such questions and make these weapons conceptually transparent run in parallel. In 2016, Himes observed that, quote, at present, the United States is the dominant user of armed drones, but that will change. The United States is in the position of setting a precedent for drone use, and we ought to establish norms that we would wish others, including our rivals, to follow. Now, the same seems to be holding true for AWS. Although these systems are not yet in widespread development, writes Kelly M. Saylor in a 2024 U.S. Defense Primer, developments in both autonomous weapons technology and international discussions of lethal autonomous weapons systems could hold implications for congressional oversight, defense investments, military concepts of operations, treaty making, and the future of war. The present posture of military and political policies toward AWS bears a striking resemblance, then, to the pensive stance that was once taken toward the topic of targeted killing. The past debates can thus be mined for relevant insights into our present situation. Perhaps a useful similarity between AWS and targeted killings is that between their contexts of employment, of use cases. Just as the latter have flourished in counterterrorism efforts, so too do AWS readily present themselves as appealing solutions to terror threats. In both cases, the context of military engagement is asymmetrical, wherein the state is threatened by individuals, groups of individuals, acting independently of some superordinate state authority. In discussing the work by Asa Kasher and Amos Yadlin, Himes summarizes the asymmetry of counter-terrorist targeted killings as follows: an act of self-defense on the part of the state. So one belligerent, in a sense, you could say the threatened state, in employing a targeted killing against another belligerent, in this case a terrorist or a group thereof, has available possible justification of self-defense. Debates over targeted killings have thus centered around who is being defended against over the status of the targets. For example, whether they are unlawful combatants, so-called irregular belligerents, or hostile civilians without protection of combatant status. A similar situation involving AWS can readily be envisioned and the attendant debates have similarly focused on the exact sort of subjectivity which an AWS would be responding to, and the broader asymmetry between victim states and terrorists. Several theorists have posed cutting critiques of AWS within this asymmetry, and so far now I'm going to present and then critique the prominent representatives of such criticisms. After this, I'm then going to try and, again, draw some conceptual pillars from the targeted killing literature. So, Skirker et al. In their 2020 paper formulate a deontological objection, that is a duty-based objection to the usage of AWS, largely based on the notion that the martial contract between human combatants mandates that service personnel cede a right not to be directly targeted with lethal violence to other human agents alone. The authors note that highly sophisticated, or even perfect, AWS fail to escape their deontological objection. Now, the bulk of their argument centers around the notion of the moral equality of combatants and the ways in which combatants cede their right not to be attacked to enemy combatants. In parallel, the authors note that this is what happens in civil society, for example, whereby individuals cede certain liberties to civil authorities. The argument goes then that since AWS do not have the ability to reason in moral terms, combatants cannot cede their rights to these robots. Ultimately then, quote, all AWS targets are illegitimate targets. Now, Skirker et al., however, I think struggle to maintain a consistent conception of what exactly an AWS is intended to refer to. And again, here, where I'm talking about this, I mean in a richer sense than just the absence of mechanisms of intervention or control on the part of deployers post-deployment, right? Sort of in what way is an AWS operating within the battlefield? So on the one hand, they classify AWS as artificial agents. On the other hand, they entertain the idea of simply concluding that AWS can't be ceded rights because conventional machines lack agency and are mere tools for their human agents. Therefore, since the AWS is a machine, no AWS can have permission to kill service personnel or non-combatants. This ambiguity arises in part because the authors never precisely define sort of what an AWS is doing in sort of mediating the prior intentionality given command structure and the sorts of targets that are actually engaged in warfare. As such, the authors are able to, at whim, consider AWS either as agents or as instruments of warfare. Consider the manner in which Skirker et al. Respond to a potential objection, in that an objection to their argument is about whether AWS are agents or not. If autonomous weapons are not sophisticated enough to adhere to the moral rules of armed conflict, it's simply unclear why we should think of using an AWS to kill people as outsourcing the task of harming to an entity at all. It's the enemy combatant that kills people, and the weapon is merely the means by which they do so, end quote. The authors concede this objection in its conclusion that the AWS cannot be conceived of as killing the enemy itself, and instead pivot to responding to a hypothetical second prong of the objection, namely that, quote, if AWS are sophisticated enough to be able to adhere to the moral rules governing armed conflict, then they must possess attributes sufficient for moral agency and hence be duty-bearing. Thus, the only way for the authors to arrive at their view of the AWS as agent position is through positing a hypothetically hyper-sophisticated AWS that somehow attains the power of cognizing moral reasons. And this, again, sort of stipulated for this talk, is not a conclusion that I am going to entertain. So Skirker et al. Failed to provide a precise reason for considering AWS as morally aligned agents, and seem to still linger in the swamp, we could say, of quasi-agency, how we're attributing this sense of agency to AWS. And moreover, even if the agential status presumed by these theorists is supposed, the right-seating argument fails on other grounds, something I discuss more in the actual body of my paper. Proposing then that these proponents of the dignity objection fail to offer a convincing critique of AWS and a stance on whether they should be considered as agents, it's reasonable to consider the arguments espoused by prominent proponents of AWS. And this is what I will turn to next. So in Baker's 2021 paper, Baker formulates a critique of the dignity objection that builds around a form of weaponry similar to AWS. Animals. As Baker notes, psychologist B.F. Skinner worked on something called Project Pigeon during World War II, attempting, in a sense, to develop what were called pigeon-guided missiles, which we're going to abbreviate here as PGM to try and make it seem a little less comical. And so these PGM could have their courses corrected by pigeons located inside of the munitions. One might think of the pigeons here as acting like feathers on an arrow or something, whereby the already intended course is simply maintained. Baker proposes a hypothetical successor to this weapon system, distinguishing them as PGM-1, the original, and PGM-2, the new and improved. This advanced weapon system would involve the pigeons selecting which of several target options the missile would actually hit. Baker develops this second weapon system to showcase what he sees as a flaw in the dignity objection. He contends that such objectors would have to concede that in the original PGM-1 case, no one's dignity was violated, whereas in the PGM-2 case, targets did in fact have their dignity trespassed upon. In this case, then, the dignity objection would force these pigeon-controlled weapons into some class of mala in se weapons, or even themselves, among the likes of, for example, chemical weapons. Skirker et al. Also notes the absurdity of classifying weapons like AWS themselves, and this is one of their key divergence from other theorists in the field. So this critique of the dignity objection, however, I think also still misses the mark, in much the same way as Skirker et al. Fared, in that Baker expresses some hesitation as to whether or not to assign agency or reason-making behavior or something like that to the pigeons under PGM-2. For example, pigeons are not said to decide which target to hit, but only to decide. The single quotes being used intentionally on their part for the concept of a pigeon as a full-fledged moral agent seems implausible to most. So a fine line is being walked, or at least an attempt is made, whereby AWS, pigeons, can both make reasons-based decisions and also not be conflated with agential actors. And here again, we see the label quasi-agency apply. And so the problem of absent theoretical understanding of AWS plagues both advocates and objectors to the employment of AWS. More to the point, this entire vein of back and forth debate seems unnecessary if it is in fact the case that AWS cannot be construed as agents in the first place. That is to say, if all AWS necessarily exists at the level of the unsophisticated AWS. And so having seen this claim of quasi-agency crop up, which is mostly defended, or is a term that I pull from Robillard, we might think that critique that he offers of the AWS as agent position holds weight. And so now I'll briefly do his argument. Here we have defended the position of the AWS as instrument conception by adapting Ned Block's Chinese nation thought experiment. This is a rather famous philosophy field, though I expect no one else to know it, which is fine. You don't need to know it. But he develops this, what he sort of in parallel calls China bot thought experiment. In this experiment, we're to imagine every person living in China. This is an arbitrary country, though it has a high population and serves his point well in that sense, as sort of stopping what they're doing and carrying out some finite command, some set of instructions given to them, such that as an aggregate, the country is to perfectly mirror the entire software of some AWS. Robillard concludes from this that, quote, in the same way that there is no additional metaphysical group agent China over and above the individual Chinese people whose actions serve to functionally realize the AWS software program, so too, I argue, there is no additional metaphysical agent, the AWS. To avoid having to engage with a dearth of sort of the philosophy of mind literature, a fate that I can only hope that he himself wouldn't dare wish that we have to entertain, I'm going to instead turn my attention to the relevant defense that he gives of his argument. Namely, that in the thought experiment, Robillard believes to show that if, quote, we could speak and understand the exceptionally long conjunction of citizen A's decision and citizen B's decision and citizen C's decision and so on and so forth, without any need whatsoever to refer to the set of decisions made by the nation of China itself, or alternatively by the AWS, then we would, again, have no need for such sort of a superstanding physical concept where we posit some agentiality or rationality to autonomous weapons. And so in a sense, he believed that in the chain of command, that is to say, the chain of intentions or reasons that leads to the deployment of AWS, every step of the process can be explained without having to appeal to the overall intention or reason behind the AWS. Now, because of this, he thinks there is no reason to posit the AWS as agent. And so he arrives at what I have again dubbed the AWS as instrument conception. Robillard does note that the China-bot experiment isn't an argument per se against the concept of collective agency, right, or collective sort of intentionality. He continues, however, to argue that most, if not all, collectivists will nonetheless argue that individuals in the group will at least bear some degree of responsibility for their causal contributions to the group act. And more to the point, Robillard thinks that these same collectivists will have to concede that if the AWS is to have something like genuine agency, it alone can have responsibility for its actions. Thus, he finds the collectivist position of ascribing agency to the AWS to be contradictory. Now, to lift the curtain very briefly, I support the AWS instrument standpoint, the instrumentalized view, not the view that holds AWS to be agents or rational players in any sense. The specific defense of this standpoint, though, that Robillard offers, I think, is an insufficient ground for this position. As I noted earlier, his analysis rendered no case in which the original motivating intention that underlies any attack by AWS would have to be appealed to. This argumentative pillar can be chiseled away, I think, through the consultation of, again, the targeted killing literature, in addition to maybe some more conventional historical examples of different forms of warfare. This is what I would turn to. Fourth section. So Daniel Statman's defense, targeted killing, incorporates two argumentative prongs, and crucially, one of which concerns who is being targeted. Unlike other forms of war, where people are killed anonymously or en masse as collateral damage, or simply because they are the enemy, targeted killing singles out morally responsible, particularly aggressive individuals. The benefit of targeted killings, we might say, is supposed to lie in the precise tailoring of intention and outcome. A victim state intends to kill some terrorist, and supposing ideal circumstances at least, only that target is killed. Neither in terms of the state's belligerent intention, nor in terms of the chosen targets, is there any non-specificity or non-particularity at play. Particularized intentions and particularized targets. Now, one of the most significant characteristics of autonomous weapons that serve to distinguish their employments from cases of targeted killing is the absence of an originally particularized intention. Crucially, this is what makes them autonomous. It is part and parcel of autonomous weapon systems that they select targets without operators being in the loop. AWS then may very well be specially designed to, for example, hunt down enemy insurgent forces, but the actual particular targets chosen are not intentionally chosen beforehand by the AWS designers or relevant commanders or programmers or whoever. It is impossible, given our definition of AWS, to consider the intention underlying their deployment in any other way than reference to enemy belligerence in general. In short, AWS use cases involve non-particularized intentions. Now, whether such weapons involve particularized or non-particularized targets is not, I think, yet in this presentation fully clear. If the targets of AWS are particularized, that is, if they're chosen as specific, uniquely chosen targets, Robillard's position would seemingly be bolstered. If such targets are rendered only non-particularly, that is, if they're attacked only as interchangeable representative members of some broader superordinate group, the AWS's instrument could be upheld without endorsing something like Robillard's, which relies on rejection of anything like collective agency. Now, to this end, I consider the exemplars of two contrasting scenarios, which I'm going to draw from historical battlefield accounts. In my paper, they're given in full. Here, I'm not going to for the sake of time, but I included sort of longer quotes in the paper because I think they really help sort of actually grasp the sort of scenario that I'm describing. So see my paper for more details. But by referencing these examples, we can suss out which scenario better maps onto AWS use cases, and thereby determine, hopefully, whether we can feasibly circumvent the previously discussed position by Robillard. Now, the first historical example that I'm going to engage with is that of a battle in Epipolae, described by Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War. So we could imagine the disordered fight, for example, in which attacking Athenian soldiers clashed with the Syracusan defenders. In broad strokes, group-level intentions are held in common by both two militaries in general, and thus by the representative main chance, and the constitutive soldiers specifically. So on the one hand, Athens intends to attack Syracuse. Syracuse intends the reverse. On the other hand, the Athenian forces on land, prior to combat, merely intend to attack the Syracusans, i.e., each Athenian does not have a formed intention to attack this or that defending Syracusan. The same holds for the intentions of the Syracusan army. Such group-level intentions, however, are not the directly motivating intentions during the fighting. Instead, hand-to-hand combat, for example, ensues upon the land forces meeting, in which one particular Athenian, we could say, clashes with another particular Syracusan. Targets, in this case, have to be chosen by each soldier, but if only for a fleeting moment. The man with the sword, we could say, can only intend to fight his counterpart, not an army. And so, a non-particularized target motivates the combat in question, yet a particularized target dies. The agents that mediate this original intention and the targets that are killed, the soldiers, thus actively particularize the belligerent intention. This follows, we could say, from the limitations of the means of warfare. As I said, the individual swordsman can only truly intend to fight another individual. In direct analysis of the sort of belligerent intentionality at play, then, what we find are non-particularized intentions and particularized targets. Again, this is sort of a fine-grained distinction, but I think it's very important for precisely pinning down what is happening in the AWS case. So the second historical example that I'm going to turn to is a battle described by an English soldier in the Napoleonic Wars. In the previous case, each Syracusan that encountered an Athenian knows him to be sort of his enemy, we could say, which is to say that his enemy is distinct enough to constitute being an enemy himself, particularly. On the contrary, this case, Napoleonic Wars, presents the battlefield radically tainted with, say, indistinctness, haze. Above, as I discussed in my paper, the author details a lack of knowledge of the occurrence of any particulars. Indeed, in terms of awareness of the state of battle, but also in terms of who his comrades were shooting at. Yeah, they were soldiers of the French army, but this is all that's known. Crucially, it seems that this case demonstrates a circumstance where the individual does not make an enemy of particular enemy combatants. Rather, his enemy still preserves its generality. The enemy whom each member of the English military shoots at is the French military at large, not some specifiable soldier. So it seems in this case, it can't be fully translated from group-level terms into individual-level terms. It's a scenario wherein the event isn't reducible to the individual instantiations of the event without both losing the genuine intention behind the scenario and confabulating new intentions to explain each member-wise interaction. Now, in much the same way that the Athenian intention to attack the Syracusans is means-limited, thus becoming restricted to particularized instances of that original group-level intention, the militaries presently under discussion are also means-limited. Yet, this restriction is one that precludes particularization of the group-level intention. So rifles and accuracy, in addition to other battlefield considerations, in fact mandates this. Analyzing relevant intentions, then, yields the following observation. At play are non-particularized intentions and non-particularized targets. In the battle at Hippolyte, that which particularized the group-level intention of each army is the individual soldier. As a subjectivity, an agent, the means-limited soldier mediates the collective and the individual. It is seemingly his capacity for free choice that enables this mediative ability. Given my initial stipulation, then, that AWS can't be treated as genuinely autonomous, the abilities to choose freely and to particularize a group-level intention are precluded from the sphere of capabilities accessible to AWS. Thus, the first historical case is, I think, an inappropriate comparison to scenarios involving autonomous weapons. The case of non-particularized warfare, Napoleonic Wars, then, seems the better fitting comparison. If a victim state sought to kill hostile insurgents or terrorists, and the state decided to do so via the use of AWS, as opposed to the prior cases which involve some physical human presence on the ground, the ensuing events could be given the simple summary: AWS are deployed, which identify and then engage enemy belligerents, and then the AWS actually does engage and attack the enemy belligerents. Should one choose to replace, AWS with English column or something, the summary would be just as accurate regarding the above discussed Napoleonic case. In brief, the cases, I think, are essentially the same, and so I contend that AWS are nothing more than, as I typically put it, tomorrow's riflemen. AWS, in order to still be considered as autonomous, must not have their targets given any sort of determinate particularity beforehand. This we've already discussed. But while each element of AWS software might be explicable in terms of its individual function, the autonomous weapons themselves necessarily exist as the results of group-level, collective-oriented intentions. A state's chain of command has deployed AWS in order to attack enemy combatants in general. The relevant collective intention responsible for the deployment of AWS and the targeting that they engage in must be the originary indeterminate intention that brought about their implementation. No subroutine of the AWS is genuinely explicable without reference to the indeterminate intention behind its employment. To posit otherwise would require one to suppose that the autonomous weapon has its own entirely independent reasons for targeting whomever it does. This, of course, requires one to argue that the AWS was not actually set forth into action by such and such military body. In other words, it would have to be posited as autonomous from the outset, that is, to be posited as free. Again, which I think is a radical conclusion. This then works against Robillard's ChinaBot example and demonstrates the relevance of genuine group agency and intention in AWS use cases. So his arguments behind the AWS instrument conception seem also to fail, but this doesn't come at the expense of the broader AWS instrumentalized position, quite the contrary. In having argued for the conceptualization of AWS as being glorified riflemen, lost in the fog of war and the smoke of battle, AWS have been instrumentalized. If all that's at play are non-particularized intentions and non-particularized targets, it is simply the case that AWS are direct extensions of state military and defensive interests. Now, in my paper, I go into further sort of ethical runoff issues, which I think are quite interesting. However, the framing of my project is one conceptual clarification. I'm not trying to give the answers of how to regulate autonomous weapons, incorporate them into IHL considerations, and develop policy. Right? That's not really why I'm here. You brought a philosopher into the lawyer's den, and so I think this is sort of the best place that I can actually attempt to be of some use among you much more qualified professionals. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus, for this incredibly rich paper and presentation. And I can see that you tweaked some of the aspects after Ambassador's initial talk, and I think it's a much clearer representation of your thoughts. Some of the comments I had towards the paper have already been corrected in the way you presented it. Where do I start? There is a lot to unpack. There is a lot of discussion from different disciplines about autonomous weapons. But I think that where the most added value comes from the interdisciplinary approaches. And this is, I think, my major methodology point to your initial work. that you are clearly very well versed in philosophical literature on the topic, but there is a lot of more. And I understand that you don't want to go into the legal or military aspects. That's fine. But there's already plenty of work written by lawyers and philosophers combined, and I will be happy to direct you into more specific pieces which would enrich your understanding and perception of different problems. So that's one thing. The second is the structure. And I think that clearly your literature review is very comprehensive within the philosophy part of it. But it's, from my perspective as a reader, a little bit too much. Meaning your paper is 25 pages long and you get to your points on page 12. That's too late. And I think it was also reflected in your presentation that your engagement with existing views is valuable, but I think it's the balance on where you put in your own voice and when you build on existing accounts, which is fine, that's the way it should be done. But I think you could be more assertive. This is what I think, and these are my arguments, rather than just respond to existing accounts. So this would be methodology and structure. Now we go to the substance. One more thing about methodology. I shared a room in my previous position with a philosopher for 3 years, and it took us 1.5 years to figure out that when we say agent, me being a lawyer and him being a philosopher, we mean very different things. Yeah. So for future reference, when you speak to an audience like this, treat us like 5-year-olds and explain to us what you mean when you say an agent. Because believe me, lawyers in the room hear a very different concept than you have in mind.
It is general good to treat lawyers as 5-year-olds.
All right. That said, I don't know whether you conceive this project as a bigger one or is it a one-off paper, just, the intellectual exercise in one of the many papers you think of publishing during your PhD studies. But the topic of subjectivity in warfare towards autonomous weapons is probably the most fascinating one you can deal with, and there is still plenty of work that can be done and can be new, which isn't easy in this field in general. There's way too much written already. But this is where I'm going to challenge you on the substance of your approach. Because you seem to focus on agent versus instrument only. And then if you extend it to, again, your concept of what's subjectivity, what do you mean by this? Is it also the value judgment? Is it the assessment of intentions? Is it the assessment of emotions? What do you mean by subjectivity? I don't know that, but I'm only a lawyer. For me, it's a very abstract concept. But again, you need to explain it to the reader early on, because trust me, you know more than they do. Now, depending on the frame you choose, I would advise you rethink the reference point to targeted killings. And here's why. And this is a very legal approach to the topic from someone who followed the international debates, again, on the regulation. And this is not something you're very much interested in, as you said. But here is the problem. Targeted killings necessarily relates to individual persons. And this is the least likely example, least likely scenario lethal autonomous weapons are going to be used. If there is one thing everyone agrees upon, is that it's not going to happen soon, at least not lawfully. So you choosing this as a conceptual framework wasn't quite clear to me, especially since both in the presentation and the paper, you said that out of the 3 requirements, 2 are not met. So it wasn't from the get on clear to me why is this a framework at all if it doesn't quite fit. another aspect, and I think this is something many people get lost in between, and I think you've fallen into this conceptual trap a little bit yourself, is the distinction between autonomous and fully autonomous weapons. I think implicit in your analysis is that autonomous might be already there, but fully autonomous not yet. Again, I would be happy to send you more literature about this arguably blurred conceptual distinction. I personally think that autonomous weapons have been with us for a while. Fully autonomous weapons will never be with us, but this might take a minute. And finally, going back to your historical comparisons of cases, I'm not quite sure why you, in the absence of intention and this whole take on the issue, I like it, but I'm not sure why you went from hand-to-hand combat of 19th century to AWS. Why didn't you go from aerial warfare, which put distance between the target and the attacker, to AWS? There's a lot happened in between, so it wasn't quite clear to me why we made the jump from the 19th century all the way to more or less now. And yes, should you like to explore the broader concept of subjectivity, and that would include the value judgment, intentions, and emotions? There is plenty of very specific legal and operational aspects to the deployment of these autonomous weapons that could be of interest. And I would be very much interested in hearing the philosopher take on it. But it's your decision whether you want to take the project this direction, right? And I'm going to close with something I started with, and it's the engagement of literature other than purely philosophical to give more granularity to your fundamental concepts. Again, what's a WS? You've defined it in your very first page in the abstract as a weapon that operates without a fixed predetermined target. All weapons operate. I know it's a mental shortcut, but these are these little nuances that kind of lose the focus a little bit of the paper. I think that's enough for now. So I'm going to stop here. But thank you very much. It's a fascinating topic, and should you like to explore it further, I would be happy to get in touch with you after this as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Or should we start this question?
I can give a brief response first. Thank you for this. One of the reasons that I applied to this conference and was encouraged to apply to this conference is because I have interests that sort of take me out of philosophy departments. But again, there's still maybe like a lack of familiarity with methods or terms or literature bodies. So all of those points that you've given, I think spot on. And I appreciate the observations. And maybe where I should be more careful or engage more with sort of the non-philosophical points. Especially on this point of agent. It became, as soon as you mentioned it, I completely realized. Let's see, what else? So the framing of the targeted killing wasn't in the original draft of the paper. I don't think that I submitted last year. Since then, I read a book on targeted killing literature, and it's sort of I saw a lot of similarities, not in terms of maybe the actual operational practice of targeted killing versus the use of lethal autonomous weapons, but in terms of if this is going to sound so cliche, like a revolution in weapons technology or something, where you have a really rapid development of a lot of the technology and poses sort of this like open, like conceptual or ontological questions, like how these things fit into a broader, like deployment schema. So that was the main point of reference where I saw the target killing literature as helpful, not so much as in dealing with the same subject matter, but maybe more, it was already a case, a very sort of obvious case where these sorts of questions had to be worked through. So I saw it more as like the doorway to the project. I don't actually know if the target killing stuff I talk about has much of a substantial role in my argument. I think it's weird as a framing device, but it's only a framing device. I think it's not supposed to be doing sort of strong argumentative support work. Maybe I overplayed it though. I got very excited after I read some stuff earlier this year. And then the historical example case, I think is the last thing I'm going to point to. Again, I'm glad you liked them. I thought I overdid the historical examples much. That was also part of the revisions from last year's paper to this one. The jump from the 19th century case to the present and skipping over the aerial warfare is again because I'm trying to draw from both the ancient case, the Greek case, and this one, maybe more different sorts of ways, like sort of schemas in which sorts of command intentions are made manifest on the battlefield in terms of particularized or non-particularized targeting or something like this. And so I just needed, in my sense of things, to find two examples that sort of mapped onto these different sorts of cases to try and give them life. They could just be cut, and the exact time when they're from is irrelevant. It was supposed to just sort of exemplify, again, like the non-particularized intention, particularized target versus both being non-particularized in the 1800s case. Again, which I think is the sort of thing that is happening with autonomous weapons. So I don't know if that still justifies it or not, but at least that's my sense behind it is these are arbitrary examples, and there's not supposed to be any sort of like, historical development being shown or anything like that. They're just plucked from some papers I've read. But no, I think that's the best I would say for that. And everything else I think is spot on and very helpful. I would love to especially get more of this literature from you, from the legal side. So yeah, maybe I'll send you an email after.
Please do.
But thanks.
Thanks. I should note that you're definitely not the first philosopher we've had in the workshops, and it seems that in many of the cases there is a conceptual gap of how to address things, and then philosophers are definitely have a freer mind than lawyers when it comes to rethinking the framework, because we are very strict within the set of laws of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And, when we do look through, when I do through philosophy, I usually look at the just war theory more than any of the others, and things like the double effect doctrine, which I find very interesting in the context of AWS, because I think there is not an extensive, but a growing amount of literature from that perspective. I think it's interesting to see a different perspective on that, and I do wonder if we do look at the agents as agents and not as instruments, would they be entitled to some conclusion before if they get caught? But apart from that, Barbara has a question.
Exactly. is really interesting. And I'd like to go deeper into one of the points that Magda made. I think you would be able to make your argument more compelling if you restricted yourself to specific types of autonomous weapons. So I don't actually think you will be able to make an argument that will work for any type, but it will definitely help you A, narrow down your evidence, and B, build a more compelling argument if you went to defining what you're going to look at. Now, it could be, for instance, that you say, I'm going to look at a reaper drone. It has a carry load of 2,900 something kilos. It can do this and that and the other. The software behind it is. And that also make it more tangible for you to imagine. Now, the dimensions I was thinking about, are we talking about a single drone, something really, really small, like something that you can put a camera on and you send it out there? Are we thinking about a swarm of drones? If we're thinking about a swarm, is the AWS something that's steering a swarm, or is it something built into the individual drone? Are we talking of something that has like nuclear capacity and could kill a whole load of people, or something really small? So the question of size will, in my eyes, also impact which of the examples will work best. Because not every example is equally suited for each kind of size. And the other point, in terms of agency, I think it would be worthwhile to look at the degree of sophistication of the software, you can call it software, the intelligence, whatever you really want to call it, but what's making the decisions inside it. Now, autonomous, fully autonomous could be part of the contested, possibly the contested definitions. But I think the kind of thing you might want to think through is, do I have a completely predefined decision tree, like a software that really was A or B under certain conditions? Do I have something that's updating the decision tree, for example, input from real-time imagery? How is that decision tree updated? Is it updated intelligently, based on prior logic? To what extent is the decision making in the end predetermined, or how is the software, well, whatever is inside it? Now that depends totally on your definition and your choice, able to actually come to a conclusion. And then we're already going towards AI, so what we're going to talk about in the afternoon is also worthwhile thinking about the type of AI you may have inside it. So, for example, a RAG technology will have different degrees of traceability to an olive graph. So there's a whole range of things that you could think through. You don't have to think about it all. You don't even have to understand it all. I recommend, though, that you do kind of really narrow it down to one example that's tangible to you in order to pick those examples, those historical analogies that will work well in order to support your argument.
Yeah, thanks. I really like that. Yeah, especially about this tailoring sense. I agree. That's something I'll certainly consider. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'm afraid I have a legal perspective here, but I believe the law is the generate sum of philosophy. So I believe that the connection is probably quite manifest in what I will say now. So yeah, so the first point is I'm arguing on the point of the term of comparison you've chosen, the targeted killing practice. Whether it makes sense or not. So I just wanted to list a number of issues quickly. First of all, target killing can be done in many different ways. So it can be done with technology from a remote basis, but it can be a commando with a knife. So, I mean, that makes a difference. We have a huge practice of target killing from remote places. That brings about a number of issues: joystick mentality, the responsibilization of the agent, signature strikes, standardizing the features of the target, and then targeting with an almost automatic process, but of course a human decision at the basis. So there are several issues which were then emerging from the target killing practice, which opened a Pandora's box in the legal debate. And on top of that, I would say also the legal qualification of the situation. So is it an ongoing armed conflict at the global level, or we need to qualify geographically the conflicts, extraterritorial application of human rights? So I think, notwithstanding this legal dimension, which is admittedly a legal one, this has philosophical repercussions. So if you use this term of comparison, then it is, of course, important to incorporate the same ethical dilemmas in the analysis of AWS, I would say. In addition, and that's my last point, when you talk about the particularized target, which I believe it's an important distinction you make, when you introduce the decision on the particularized target, then, of course, under IHL, we know there is a problem of distinction, but then there are issues related to how you carry out the operation. So you constantly need to consider collateral damage, and in case the situation changes, reconsider. So this is an issue. Another issue is the prohibition of denial of court. So the thing should be able to accept surrender, which is another, again, it's pretty legal, but it's also an ethical dilemma. So I wanted to ask you whether you consider that the particularized particularized decision, when you say there is the particularized target, right? If you introduce this idea of course, respect for legal, philosophical, ethical issues also during the operation. That is the other point I want to make. So, thank you very much for thinking. I'm still thinking of all of that.
If nothing else, then I guess I'm successful. If you don't know what to think. The points about bringing in the targeted killing, I will have to dwell more on just sort of what sort of, like you said, Pandora's box I might have opened of bringing this in. The stuff on particularized targets is, and maybe I shouldn't have cut it from my presentation, should have planned around it. I talk much more about that in the final part of my paper on sort of these potential runoff ethical issues. I'll just give a very brief sketch and see if this at least seems like what I talk about in the paper will address some of your concerns. So there's two sort of main ethical consequences that I focus on. The first, in a sense, is whether, again, using this language of particularization, whether the particular subjectivity of persons is upheld, and this is in a sense, in a sense, within the same group of ethical objections as things relating to dignity of persons, which I think is like one or two of the questions that you have. So I at least work on addressing it. But again, the focus of the paper isn't on these ethical points, but I do mention it. The second one is maybe in the sense of like the universal value, so like the non-particular value of dignity of human persons. In a sense, asking the question, is human dignity maintained in a world in which these would be common practice in warfare? Or is there maybe something aside from the individual human person, but, you know, with humans generally, that is undermined or something by maybe a fundamental shift in modalities for warfare towards something that sort of utilizes AWS, which I think is more ancillary to what you were talking about, but sort of both of those sides I at least get to a little bit more in the paper. So again, I have been thinking about it. I assume not to the depth that you have, because again, I think sort of my greater interest is with the conceptual front than the ethical front. But no, these sorts of things have been on my mind. Thanks.
To be honest, when I saw the program, I was very excited to read your paper because I was doing a presentation last year on a similar topic, but it was more about drones and unmanned aircraft systems. And during my research, 2 questions came to my mind, but I think the one question fits better in the next presentation with AI. So I was thinking when automatic weapon systems are used in conflicts, I think that there is quite an imbalance created between the parties because the one party risks property damage and the other party risks their life. Maybe you can tell me your thoughts on that. Also on the thoughts of reciprocity, the principle of reciprocity. Maybe I can have your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Okay. Let me table the reciprocity thing for a second. The imbalance of risk. I don't know if I'll have anything interesting to say other than it seems like a very large ethical issue. I'm not as I say, I'm not a proponent really, I think, of the use of many sorts of autonomous weapons. I think they open themselves up to just a manifold of problematic ethical consequences. This I don't know. I assume that this is one. I don't know if it's unethical to maybe I'd say this just to carefully distinguish here. I don't know if it's unethical to risk less, maybe you would say, in some type of armed engagement, but it's the unethical consequence would be that the enemy combatant is risking too much, right? So if we just had robots fighting each other, maybe there's no issue if one robot is worth slightly more material cost. Right? Again, I don't think that's the lack of risk. I don't think is an issue, but you're probably maybe in a similar adjacent sort of way to the dignity objection or questions relating to moral equality combatants. You are attempting to cede your rights to just this empty mechanical husk that can't properly be a bearer of that ceding. The reciprocity issue, I'm not sure, mainly because that comes from this sort of like substantializing of autonomous weapons and trying to pin on them some type of responsibility, or that there are even things that can enter into context where responsibility is relevant. And again, maybe the ethical issue then is just we sort of wholesale preclude that type of mutual combatant relationship from the existing when these sorts of weapons are employed. If that touches on what you were asking about reciprocity.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Like Marco, I wanted to ask a lawyer. So point at a legal issue in relation to targeted killings that kind of complicates this example, or we could rely on this is that in practice, if you look at targeted killings, the question whether or not the person itself may be engaged, whether or not it's the person potentially, depending on the situation, have to be answered under IHL. But many targeted killings do not take place in theater of war. That's one of kind of the features, that it takes place at random various places in the world. And the important legal framework that also deals with that normal use of force, but the use ad bellum, is inherently political in terms of the it's where the idea to keep ad bellum and bello separate is in order to avoid the politics seeping into the international humanitarian law. But the decision to engage in another country, because that would start an international encounter with that country or violation of the territory, engaged without consent, is something that's not taken purely on the basis of the law. There may be a right to respond. You mentioned self-defense as well. There may be a right to respond to self-defense. It doesn't mean that you always immediately have to. And that human decision-making aspect in the exercise of certain conduct that is, besides IHL, also very much regulated by the law of use of force, is something that I find hard to place here. Like, do you want to engage a certain individual in the state, which means that you're also violating the sovereignty of that state, the territorial integrity of that state, if you violate the law of use of force? And then often the decision might be, no, we will engage this person elsewhere. So I'm just wondering how that aspect, which is not possible to as easily some IHL with either, but translate into zeros and ones, how you would deal with that.
Yeah. This point about having maybe a right to self-defense or something like that on the part of the state versus between acting on that right or carrying out of that, it is quite interesting. I think maybe there's a lot that you said, so I'm trying to keep it all together. Maybe I would note specifically with the targeted killing case, where AWS can differ itself from the targeted killing case is in the sense that I can't pin down any other bearer of responsibility in the AWS case, except to the state itself, essentially, whether that's military chain of command or the commanding officer that deploys AWS, or whether we blame the coder or whoever. But in targeted killing cases, it's not only tied to self-defense. And by that, I mean, it's not only tied to, the state's defense of itself, because we can condemn other morally responsible or potentially morally responsible individuals sort of in between. So as regards self-defense, then, I think maybe it at least, I don't think it's totally misplaced just to talk about, because the use of AWS, in a sense, this is, I don't know if I have a coherent answer. I'm able to put together what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I mean, could you clarify the question again? I thought I had an answer, and now I'm thinking
well, I'm given that you chose this specific topic of targeted killing and such a important aspect in deciding to kill someone by means of what we consider targeted killing in specific situations, is the very human decision to say, like, we'll do it in Somalia because Somalia is not going to stand up against us.
Yeah.
And not going to actually raise this issue of our violation of the law of use of force, for example. And not to do it in another country, how you see that, which I can imagine is something you can translate into a code. So how do you see that kind of essential aspect of the decision-making process in relation to targeted killings in relation to well.
I see. Okay, so that thanks. That makes it clear. Okay, so I guess maybe it just relies on a sense that autonomous weapons aren't. Gosh, this is going to be so literary or something. You know, once deployed, they don't just sort of wander the earth looking for more targets. At least the sense that I have in mind for any conception of autonomous weapon systems still operate within some type of definite operational context or a definite time frame or something, such that though there are maybe there's an important lack of human deliberative elements at play, where you could say, well, right, this could be a proper response out of self-defense, but politically this is unjustifiable. We don't need to do this. Though that is, sort of only can occur with the deployment of the AWS, and once it's gone, in a sense, it's gone. It still is in play, just maybe in a very, it's only at play still in that initial stage. There can't be further deliberations. And so maybe it's something like just the inability for long-term control or fine-grained distinction making that relies on a human bear of responsibility would be absent. And again, maybe that just filters into ethical critique of AWS on IHL grounds or otherwise. I think in some minimal sense, it still is in play, just in the sense of given this context in which a state is, state military is deciding whether or not to deploy some type of autonomous weapon system. Those types of deliberative calculations and the sort of rational factors at play are still present. And then, of course, once it's deployed, precluded. But I don't think they're totally different. It's not that it does occur in one case and it just doesn't occur with the autonomous weapons. It occurs in the targeted killing case, just in a maybe much more rich and therefore like justifiable sense, or works to justify the use of targeted killings. So I don't see it as totally absent in the autonomous weapons case.
One more word here. I think the reason why you disagree is that let me back that up. For autonomous weapon systems to operate, they have to have pre-selected class or group of targets.
Yes.
They need to share a common characteristic, this class, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And let's leave aside for a second how difficult it is to translate into a code, which would be an algorithm, right? But once we have a class of people in this case, it wouldn't be what lawyers call targeted killings. Does it make any sense?
Say it again.
So, in case for a lawyer, when we say a targeted killing, it means we kill Bob because Bob did A, B, and C.
Yes.
Jack didn't do A, B, and C. So once we have a group of people who did the same thing and we search for this specific class, it stops being targeted killings for lawyers. So it's targeted killing for a lawyer, international lawyer, as long as it's very individualized for Bob.
Yes.
Make sense?
Yes.
And that's why I think you're talking a little bit over each other. Because Marcus, you're a philosopher and Georg is very much a lawyer. And this is where your concepts just cross each other, I think. I can talk to you.
As a follow-up for that, we go to I think because you're using targeted killing, somewhat of a random example that came up alongside your reading and following some of the conversations, it would be interesting to pick on that specific point of using AWS for targeted tuning, but also for behavior-based targeting. Because if you're saying, okay, I have a system that can analyze a certain territory in order to limit the solvent and remove most of Ophir's question about operating in a different state, but within a certain territory, within a certain period of time, if a certain person is acting in a certain way, then whether or not that person will be targetable. And there are legal questions that have already been discussed about, I think it was in Afghanistan, where a person was digging a hole and the military thought that that was preparation for an IED or something like that, and they target that person, and that person was a farmer doing a legitimate activity. And this is where the human issue and the AWS within AI and certain aspects could bring very, very interesting ethical questions on the use of AWS. So that comparison to identify killing and behavior-based killing would be interesting as part of that discussion.
Yes. I was just wondering, and I guess it has been kind of answered maybe, but anyway, how would the instrumental view align with proof on station and proportionality? I was just wondering, because, this kind of must be proportional, not excessive. And you said that the autonomous weapon system, of course, operate without these predetermined targets. Yeah. I was just wondering, is the proportionality ever given in that case?
Yeah, the distinction point, I think, is the easier one to talk about. If there's not, if essentially we develop some, gigantic data heuristic that is just a black box of categories that do exist for target, don't target. It seems that there's such a lack of readability or interpretability. There are issues there. And so the proportionality point is something I don't know if I have an easy observation on. Again, this is now becoming my cop-out, but it has this sort of this ethical or legal ramification of things that I just don't claim to be an expert in, or in some cases very, very knowledgeable in. So probably I would just defer to the existing bodies of literature or other much more qualified people.
Okay.
Sure, I can if we need to update. Okay. Two quick comments. First, about reading, and the second about interdisciplinarity. So about reading, no worries. If you begin your career, it's a very normal threat, and even ambassadors out there, higher positions can read their presentations as keynote speakers. So no worries about that. And the second about interdisciplinarity, I agree with what Magda said, and keep to her because she's a big Bible of knowledge about autonomous weapon systems. What I would include in your paper is to show that there are various notions of agency from the perspective of ethics, of philosophy, of law, the military, or sociology, whatever it is. And you're focusing on the specific notion, and you explain why this is the most important notion of agency that would be useful for all of us who are unfamiliar with philosophical approaches. And then following that, I believe at the Austria Institute there is one philosopher who deals with the notion of agency, and who published about that quite extensively in relation to autonomous weapon systems, sorry to mispronounce his surname.
Solzhenitsyn.
Thanks.
That's the one whom took us a year and a half to figure out we mean different things by age.
Yeah, yeah, exactly that one. But I remember that she mentioned some construct about the meaning of agency in relation to the perspective of technological determinism and then social constructs of technology, how these two concepts interplay with each other, and then proposed a third approach to that. So maybe that also would be useful, but you already have an extensive literature on the topic, so that's only a suggestion. But anyway, please do make your paper like the most important in the notion, in understanding the notion of agency in relation to autonomous weapons.
It's a great observation. Thank you.
Very brief two thoughts. I don't know whether it's relevant, but you mentioned the pigeon, but then I remembered the dog that was swimming in the water with the Russians working outside. He was a very cute dog. Broke my heart. Yes, but broke my heart to see him being especially trained for that purposes. So if you have any thoughts or ideas about that, that would be fascinating to hear. And the other thing, if I remember correctly, and I must admit I did not really check, but because you are in the warfare domain and the elements of subjectivity there, either it's the year 2011 or 2013, a huge roundtable was done in San Remo about the autonomous weapons, if I remember correctly, and these things were discussed. And maybe I think there should be a publication with raising certain issues about the targeting and the way the algorithm is being translated into practice and what kind of problems were coming ahead of this decision making and keeping the human in the loop.
Oh, thanks. Second point, certainly that look not speaking to it.
Which year is that?
I don't know.
Well, right.
No, that's what I'm saying. I will go find what year it is. No, the sort of historical antecedent to a lot of contemporary literature on autonomous weapons is quite interesting to see how it sort of develops as a very hotly discussed topic. On the first point, perhaps there's a sense in which my more silly pigeon case and it makes me chuckle every time I see it. So, and the dolphin case, I don't know. Maybe there's some broad correlation in terms of reasoning for or against the vesting of crucial military decisions in a sense to animals that has similar dignity problems or problems in terms of combatant equality or the ability to sort of cede rights to each other or whoever, that follows in tandem with the autonomous weapons case. Perhaps it is for very similar reasons wrong to outsource moral responsibility and reasoning to robots in the same way that it's wrong to outsource it to animals. But then the flip side of that is it doesn't include the use, maybe we'll just say non-deliberative or non-rights-bearing things wholesale, right? So just because you wouldn't want to have some type of strongly, in this vague sense, autonomous weapon, be sort of like the linchpin in terms of a chain of moral responsibility. You wouldn't want an animal to be. It doesn't mean it can't be instrumentalized as sort of a down the road step in a broader operational plan that does allow for proper deliberative rational agents to make sort of those moral choices. So I think they're very similar, but again, I don't think either case is a sort of a blanket wholesale preclusion of their use just from the fact that lack of autonomy. But it does preclude the use of them as, where there should be, as filling the role where there should be a moral deliberator.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.